Buried beneath the city, the tunnels stretched for miles, a labyrinth of darkness carved from rock and dirt. They were built long ago for reasons no one remembered, used over the years by smugglers, fugitives, and scavengers. 11, or 11 as he was often called, had spent much of his life navigating these underground passages. To most, they were a forgotten relic of history. To him, they were a second home, a place where he could escape the chaos above and lose himself in the shadows. Before we start, hit the like and subscribe buttons for more exclusive news. 11 had earned a reputation in his circle for his skill in uncovering hidden treasures buried in these tunnels. Some of the relics he dug up were mundane: rusted tools, cracked pottery, scraps of fabric. Others were valuable: old coins, rare artifacts, even gold. Diddy, a local hustler with a penchant for taking risks, saw potential in 11's knack for unearthing secrets. He paid 11 handsomely for his finds and resold them for a hefty profit. Their partnership was simple: Diddy pointed to a spot and 11 dug. It was on one such job that everything changed. Diddy had gotten wind of something big: rumors of a stash hidden deep in the tunnel network, sealed away in a chamber no one had touched for decades. The story had come from an old drunkard who swore on his life that the chamber contained riches beyond imagination. Diddy, ever the opportunist, had leaped at the chance, and 11, lured by the promise of a generous cut, had reluctantly agreed. The location was in one of the deeper parts of the tunnels, far from the sections 11 usually explored. The air was damp and heavy, thick with the smell of mold and decay. His flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the walls where water trickled down in thin streams. The deeper they went, the quieter it became, the muffled sounds of the city above fading into an oppressive silence. "Here," Diddy said finally, his voice echoing in the emptiness. He pointed to a patch of dirt against the tunnel wall. "This is the spot." 11 hesitated. Something about the place felt wrong. The air seemed colder here, and the shadows clung to the walls like they were alive. But Diddy was insistent, and the promise of a payday pushed 11 to put his unease aside. He grabbed his tools and began to dig. The work was slow, the soil stubborn and packed tight. Sweat dripped down his face as he chipped away at the earth, the sound of his shovel filling the tunnel. Hours passed, and his arms ached, but eventually his shovel struck something solid. It was a wooden box, its edges rotted and splintered with age. He pried it open, expecting gold or jewels, but what he found instead was far stranger. Inside were bundles of old, yellowed papers tied together with fraying string. They were covered in strange symbols and markings, a language he didn't recognize. Beneath the papers was a small, ornate dagger, its blade tarnished but still sharp. The handle was carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift when he looked at them too long. At the bottom of the box lay a small black book. Its cover was smooth and cold to the touch, with no title or markings to hint at its contents. "That it?" Diddy asked, peering over 11's shoulder. He sounded disappointed. "Doesn't look like much." 11 shrugged. "Could be valuable to the right person. These old artifacts always have collectors." Diddy grumbled, but seemed satisfied enough to take the haul. They packed up the box and made their way back to the surface, the sense of unease lingering in the back of 11's mind. It wasn't until a few days later that things began to unravel. Diddy had taken the box and its contents to a local appraiser, a wiry old man with a knack for identifying rare items. The appraiser had barely touched the black book before recoiling in horror, muttering about curses and dark magic. He refused to have anything more to do with it and warned Diddy to get rid of it immediately. Diddy, always skeptical of superstition, ignored the warning and kept the book, intrigued by its mysterious nature. Meanwhile, 11 started noticing strange things. At first, it was small, a sense of being watched, shadows that seemed to move when he wasn't looking. Then the nightmares began. Every night he dreamed of the tunnel, of digging up the box. But in his dreams, the symbols on the papers glowed, and the dagger whispered to him in a voice he couldn't understand. He would wake up drenched in sweat, his heart pounding, the whispers still echoing in his ears. Diddy wasn't faring much better. He became obsessed with the book, spending hours locked in his apartment, poring over its pages. He claimed the symbols inside were starting to make sense, that they were revealing secrets to him. His health began to deteriorate. He grew pale and gaunt, his eyes sunken and hollow. When 11 confronted him, Diddy dismissed his concerns, insisting he was fine. But 11 knew something was wrong. He could feel it in his bones. The same sense of unease he'd felt in the tunnel now magnified tenfold. He tried to distance himself from Diddy and the cursed relics, but the nightmares persisted, and the whispers grew louder. It was as if whatever they had unearthed was following him, clinging to him like a dark shadow. The breaking point came one night when Diddy called him in a panic. His voice was frantic, almost unrecognizable as he begged 11 to come over. When 11 arrived, he found Diddy's apartment in shambles. Papers were scattered everywhere, the walls covered in frantic scrawls of the same strange symbols from the book. Diddy was sitting in the corner, clutching the dagger, his hands trembling. "It's alive," Diddy whispered, his eyes wide with terror. "The book, the dagger, all of it, it's alive. I tried to stop it, but it won't let me." Before 11 could respond, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. A cold wind swept through the apartment, and the air was filled with a low, guttural sound, like the growl of some unseen beast. Shadows twisted and writhed on the walls, forming shapes that seemed almost human but not quite. Diddy screamed, and the sound was cut short, replaced by a sickening crunch. When the lights flickered back on, Diddy was gone. The dagger lay on the floor, its blade stained with blood, and the black book sat open on the table, its pages blank. 11 fled, his heart pounding as he ran through the empty streets. He tried to convince himself it was a hallucination, a trick of the mind brought on by stress and lack of sleep. But deep down, he knew the truth. Whatever they had unearthed in the tunnel wasn't just a relic of the past. It was something far older and far darker. He left the city soon after, abandoning his work and cutting ties with everyone he knew. But no matter how far he ran, he couldn't escape the shadows. They followed him wherever he went, lurking in the corners of his vision, whispering in the dead of night. The nightmares continued, growing more vivid with each passing day, and the sense of being watched never left him. Years later, 11 found himself back in the tunnels, unable to resist the pull of the place where it had all begun. The city had changed, the world above bustling with life, but the tunnels remained the same, silent, dark, and full of secrets. He wandered aimlessly, his flashlight cutting through the shadows until he reached the spot where he had dug up the box. The dirt was undisturbed, as if no one had been there since that fateful day. But as he stood there, staring at the ground, he felt a chill run down his spine. The air was cold and heavy, the silence deafening. He realized then that the tunnel wasn't just a place, it was a prison. A place where whatever they had released had been locked away, and he had been the one to set it free. As he turned to leave, he heard a sound, a low whisper, faint but unmistakable. It came from the darkness behind him, a voice that was both familiar and alien. He didn't turn around. He didn't need to. He knew what it was. And as he walked away, the whisper followed, a reminder that some secrets are meant to stay buried. The weight of the past clung to 11 like a chain, dragging him deeper into his own mind. Every step away from the tunnels felt both freeing and futile, as if no matter how far he went, the shadows of that night reached farther still. The world outside moved on, oblivious to what lay beneath. But for 11, the tunnel's darkness had become a part of him. It whispered through his thoughts, echoing in his dreams, demanding he remember. His first few months away from the city were a blur. He moved from town to town, taking odd jobs and keeping to himself. Sleep became a luxury he could no longer afford. When he closed his eyes, the nightmares were waiting. Each dream started differently. A quiet street, an abandoned building, a dense forest, but always ended the same. The symbols, the dagger, the book, and then the blackness, rushing toward him like a tide, swallowing him whole. One night, in a dingy motel on the outskirts of a small town, the dream took a different turn. He found himself back in the tunnels, walking the same path he had taken that fateful day. But this time, the box was already unearthed, its contents spread out before him. The symbols on the papers glowed faintly, casting an eerie light on the walls. The dagger hovered in the air, its blade dripping with something black and viscous, and the book lay open, its pages moving as if alive. The whispers started again, louder than ever, a cacophony of voices speaking in a language he couldn't understand. Yet somehow he felt the meaning in his bones. You cannot run, you cannot hide. You are ours now. He woke with a start, gasping for air, his body drenched in sweat. The motel room was silent, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. The shadows seemed to stretch toward him, their edges shifting unnaturally. He packed his bag and left within minutes, unable to shake the sensation that something was following him. By dawn, he had crossed into another state, the highway stretching endlessly before him. He told himself he was running from the dreams, but deep down, he knew better. The dreams weren't confined to the night. They were seeping into his waking hours, distorting his perception of reality. He saw movement where there was none, heard whispers in the wind, felt cold fingers brush against his skin when no one was near. It was as if the darkness he had unearthed was bleeding into the world around him. In a desperate bid for answers, 11 began researching the tunnels, their history, and any accounts of strange occurrences tied to them. Libraries, archives, and online forums became his refuge. He discovered that the tunnels were older than the city itself, predating even the earliest settlements in the area. Legends spoke of a group of settlers who had stumbled upon the underground network and used it as a sanctuary during harsh winters. But those who spent too much time there reportedly emerged different. Stories of madness, disappearances, and strange rituals filled the old accounts. One journal, written by a long-forgotten settler, described the discovery of a hidden chamber deep within the tunnels. The author spoke of symbols etched into the walls, a dagger resting on an altar, and a black book that seemed to hum with energy. The entries ended abruptly, with the final words scrawled in a frantic, barely legible hand. It watches. It waits. We are fools. The more 11 learned, the more he felt the pieces falling into place. The box they had uncovered wasn't a forgotten treasure. It was a warning, a barrier meant to contain something far worse, and he had been the one to break it. In his search, he came across the name of a man who claimed to have been part of an expedition into the tunnels years ago. The man, Elias Carter, was listed as a retired historian living in a remote cabin deep in the woods. Hoping for insight, 11 tracked him down and made the journey to meet him. The cabin was isolated, surrounded by dense forest with no signs of life except for a thin wisp of smoke curling from the chimney. 11 knocked on the door, and after a long pause, it creaked open. Elias was an older man, his face lined with age and worry. His eyes held a haunted look that 11 recognized all too well. "You've seen it, haven't you?" Elias said before 11 could even speak. His voice was low and gravelly, as if he hadn't spoken in days. 11 nodded, and Elias stepped aside to let him in. The cabin was cluttered with books, papers, and strange artifacts, the air thick with the smell of old wood and dust. Elias gestured for him to sit, then poured 2 cups of tea. He didn't speak again until they were both seated at the small table. "What you've brought with you. It's not meant to be touched. Not by us. Not by anyone." 11 explained everything: Diddy's obsession, the nightmares, the whispers, and the growing sense that something was hunting him. Elias listened in silence, his expression grim. "You're not the first," Elias said finally, "and you won't be the last. That thing you unearthed, it's older than we can comprehend. It doesn't belong in our world. The tunnels, those tunnels were meant to keep it contained, but humans, we can't help ourselves. We dig, we pry, we uncover what should stay buried." "What is it?" 11 asked. "What does it want?" Elias shook his head. "It's not something we can understand. It's not alive, not in the way we think of life. It's a presence, a force. Some call it a curse, others a demon, but those are just words. It exists to consume, to spread its influence, to corrupt. And once it touches you, there's no escape." "Then why hasn't it taken me already?" 11 asked, his voice trembling. "Because it's patient," Elias replied. "It doesn't kill quickly. It feeds on fear, on despair. It breaks you down piece by piece until there's nothing left, and then it takes what remains." For hours they talked, Elias sharing what he knew and 11 piecing together his own experience. Elias revealed that the only way to stop the entity's spread was to return the relics to the chamber and seal it once more. But doing so would come at a cost. "It demands a sacrifice," Elias said. "Something precious, something irreplaceable." The thought of returning to the tunnels filled 11 with dread, but he knew he had no choice. The entity's influence was growing, and if he didn't act, it would spread beyond him, infecting everything it touched. He had already seen what it had done to Diddy. He couldn't let it happen to anyone else. With Elias's help, 11 prepared for the journey. They gathered supplies, flashlights, tools, protective charms Elias swore would offer some measure of protection. Before he left, Elias handed him a small, weathered journal. "This belonged to someone like you," Elias said. "He tried to stop it, but he failed. Learn from his mistakes." The journey back to the tunnels was harrowing. The city loomed ahead like a ghost, its skyline a jagged silhouette against the gray sky. As 11 descended into the underground, the air grew colder, the silence more oppressive. The tunnels seemed darker than before, the shadows thicker, almost tangible. Every step felt like a descent into madness. The whispers were louder now, echoing off the walls, filling his head with disjointed words and phrases. The symbols etched into the pages of the journal seemed to glow faintly, guiding him deeper into the labyrinth. He reached the chamber. It was just as he remembered, though the air inside felt heavier, as if the room itself were alive. The altar stood in the center, the carvings on its surface pulsing faintly. He placed the relics, the dagger, the papers, the book, on the altar, his hands shaking. The whispers rose to a deafening roar, and the chamber seemed to close in around him. The walls pulsed, the shadows writhed, and a figure began to take shape in the darkness, a towering, indistinct form that exuded malice. "Sacrifice," the voice said, though it didn't speak aloud. It was in his mind, in his soul. 11 hesitated, fear gripping him. What could he offer? What did it want? The answer came to him in a rush of clarity. It wanted his freedom, his very being. To seal the entity away, he would have to bind himself to the chamber, becoming its new guardian. Tears streamed down his face as he made the choice. He whispered a final prayer, then stepped toward the altar. The shadows surged around him, enveloping him in darkness. For a moment there was pain, searing, unbearable pain, and then nothing. When the chamber fell silent, the relics were gone, the altar empty. The tunnels returned to their stillness, and above ground the city carried on, unaware of the sacrifice that had been made to keep them safe. But deep beneath the surface, in the heart of the tunnels, 11 remained. His body was gone, but his presence lingered, a silent guardian bound to the darkness. And though the whispers had ceased, the shadows still moved, waiting for the day when another would come to disturb their rest. Time moved strangely in the depths of the tunnels. For the city above, years passed, seasons changed, and life carried on. But deep beneath the surface, the air was stagnant, the walls unchanging. The tunnels remained as they had always been, silent, dark, and filled with secrets. And at their heart, where the shadows clung most tightly, 11 lingered. He no longer had a body, not in the sense he once understood. He was a presence, a fragment of himself stretched thin across the chamber and the surrounding tunnels. He could feel the cold stone walls, the shifting air currents, the faint vibrations of the world above. But he could no longer touch or breathe or feel in the way he once had. He was part of the place now, inseparable from it, bound by the sacrifice he had made. The entity was contained, its influence suppressed, but 11 could still sense it. An ancient, malevolent force that pulsed faintly in the depths of the chamber. It was waiting, always waiting, its hunger undiminished. Though he had stopped it from spreading, he had not destroyed it. Perhaps it could not be destroyed. It was older than time, older than the tunnels themselves, a remnant of something that defied understanding. Sometimes in the stillness, 11 could hear the faint echoes of the city above. Laughter, footsteps, the rumble of distant trains. They were muffled and indistinct, but they reminded him of what he had left behind. His sacrifice had saved those lives, kept the entity from reaching them, but it also isolated him completely. He was alone, a ghost in a place that no one remembered. But there were moments, rare and fleeting, when he was not alone. Curious explorers, thrill seekers, or scavengers would venture into the tunnels, their footsteps reverberating through the darkness. 11 could feel their presence long before they reached the chamber. He wanted to warn them, to keep them from going too far, but his voice was gone, his form intangible. All he could do was watch as they approached. When they drew near, the air in the chamber would change, growing heavier, colder. The entity would stir, its presence faint but unmistakable, as if testing the boundaries of its prison. Most of the time, the intruders would sense the wrongness of the place and leave before they could do any harm. But not always. Some lingered too long, their greed or curiosity blinding them to the danger. For those, the shadows would close in, and they would not return. 11 hated those moments. He hated the helplessness, the inability to stop what was happening. But he knew that the alternative, the entity escaping again, was far worse. He was its jailer, its warden, and its prisoner, all at once. His existence was a constant vigil, an eternal struggle to maintain the fragile balance that kept the world above safe. In the end, 11's story became one with the tunnels, a whispered legend among the few who dared to explore them. They spoke of a presence in the darkness, a guardian who watched over the ancient chambers, and the unspeakable horror he kept at bay. They didn't know his name or his sacrifice, but they felt his warning in the chill of the air and the weight of the shadows. And deep within the earth, where the light never reached, 11 remained, keeping watch, waiting for the day when someone else would make the same mistake, and hoping against all odds that they wouldn't. If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, could you leave your comments below and tell us? What are your thoughts on what he found in the tunnel for Diddy? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching and see you next time.